All right, let's go. Number 10. The Ararat Photographs. On June 17, 1949, a United States Air Force reconnaissance plane banked over eastern Turkey on a routine mapping run along the Soviet border. A crew member noticed something on the northwest corner of a high plateau, roughly 2 kilometers below the summit of a nearly 17,000-foot volcanic peak. A long, flat ridge cutting an unnatural line through the ice, exposed by a season of unusually heavy meltback. The frame clicked. Nobody on that plane knew they had just taken the first photograph in what would become a 46-year government secret. The mountain was Ararat. That photograph, and 5 others taken the same day, were stamped secret. They stayed that way. In 1956, 1973, 1976, 1990, and 1992, American aircraft and satellites photographed the same coordinates again, and each new set received the same classification. A professor named Porcher Taylor, who first heard rumors of the images as a West Point cadet in 1973, spent over 20 years filing Freedom of Information Act requests to get them released. On March 14, 1995, the Defense Intelligence Agency finally handed him a single frame. A retired senior CIA official later gave a different reason for the decades of secrecy. The imagery showed exactly what American intelligence had been watching for at that location, and releasing it in full would have revealed the target itself. Reportedly a listening post tracking missile activity across the nearby Soviet frontier. By the 1970s, the file had grown considerably. Keyhole series satellites, the same systems used to count Soviet missile silos, were tasked against the same 2-square-kilometer patch of ice on repeated occasions between 1974 and 1982, at the personal request of the sitting director of Central Intelligence. A CIA official who examined the 1973 imagery described 3 exposed structural elements in the ice, curved in a way that, in his words, formed up what would have been the bow of something or other. George Carver, a senior CIA officer briefing a private gathering years later, said there were clear indications something unusual sat on that mountain. He would not say what. The formation researchers call the Ararat anomaly measures by independent imagery analysis using pixel-level measurement software, close to 1,015 feet in length, within range of the dimensions Genesis assigns to a vessel 300 cubits long. Genesis 8:4 places the resting point of Noah's Ark in the mountains of Ararat, not on one specific peak, which means the identification of this exact ridge was always circumstantial, resting on regional tradition rather than textual precision. What was never circumstantial was the classification stamp attached to every photograph of it. But here's where the official explanation runs into a problem it cannot fully absorb. A government that wanted to dismiss the site as ordinary ice and rock did not need 6 decades of persistent reclassification to do it. Natural formations are not usually the subject of repeated, deliberate rephotography by the world's most expensive intelligence systems, reviewed by named senior officials, and then withheld from the public under national security statutes normally reserved for active military threats. Something about that coordinate justified the sustained attention of the CIA, the DIA, and the Air Force across 2 generations of officers, and the agencies involved have never explained what. The formation is still there, 3 decades after the first partial release, still argued over by geologists and researchers in roughly equal numbers. The sharper Keyhole 9 and Keyhole 11 imagery from the 1970s, far more capable of resolving what sits beneath that ice, remains classified to this day. No agency has explained on the record why photographs of a melting glacier in a NATO-allied country still meet the threshold for national security secrecy in the 21st century. Before Entry 9, if you want the physical evidence connecting scripture to the ground it describes laid out in one place, there's a 60-page ebook that walks through it clearly. The link is in the description below. Number 9. The mountain Saudi Arabia won't let anyone study. In 1984, an American wreck hunter named Ron Wyatt crossed the Saudi border with his 2 sons, drawn by a mountain nearly 400 miles from the traditional site of Mount Sinai. He did not have a permit. 78 days later, Saudi authorities arrested and expelled all three, releasing them only after they agreed never to return or discuss what they had seen. Wyatt went back anyway 11 months later, this time with a salvage operator and a piece of equipment he called a molecular frequency generator, hunting for what he believed was Exodus-era gold. He was expelled a second time and made to sign a second promise never to write about the site. The mountain is called Jabal al-Lawz, the Mountain of Almonds, and its summit is a distinctive, uniform black, scorched-looking crown visible from miles across the surrounding range, unlike every other peak nearby. Explorers who followed Wyatt describe cracking open surface rock in secret and finding the blackening confined entirely to the outer crust, with unmarked stone beneath. At the base of the mountain sit split boulders worn smooth, as if by running water, carved stone pillars, inscriptions in an ancient alphabetic script that some researchers read as early Semitic, and a low stone structure researchers have interpreted as an altar, facing the mountain rather than any settlement. A former U.S. Army Green Beret named Bob Cornuke, who traveled to the site with businessman Larry Williams in the 1990s, described sneaking past checkpoints and photographing under the threat of arrest, because open government-sanctioned archaeological survey has never once been granted at this location. Exodus 19 describes the mountain of God descending in fire, the entire summit trembling and smoke rising as from a furnace. The blackened cap of Jabal al-Lawz has drawn comparison to that description for 4 decades among researchers who favor a Saudi Arabian location for the Exodus narrative. Some of those researchers also point to inscriptions carved into the surrounding rock face in an alphabetic script known to specialists as Thamudic, arguing the letter forms resemble an early Semitic alphabet rather than the later Arabic script typically found across the wider peninsula, an identification mainstream epigraphers dispute, dating the same inscriptions instead to Nabatean-era travelers, many centuries after any proposed Exodus date. Mainstream geologists classify the coloring as a natural volcanic hornfels, produced by contact metamorphism deep in the region's Precambrian bedrock, a process entirely unconnected to any historical event, and well attested at other sites nearby that carry no religious significance at all. That geological explanation is documented and, on its own terms, sound. What it does not explain is why an active military installation still sits beside the mountain, restricting access to it specifically rather than to any of the geologically comparable peaks around it. What makes the restriction particularly hard to file away as routine is the timing. Saudi Arabia has, in the past several years, opened enormous stretches of its northwestern desert to international tourism and development as part of a sweeping new regional megaproject, complete with a planned mountain resort barely a short drive from Jabal al-Lawz itself. Hikers, off-road tour groups, and winter sports visitors now move freely through terrain that, a decade ago, would have drawn the same military scrutiny the mountain still receives. The kingdom has opened nearly everything around this one location. The location itself and the installation beside it remain closed. There is a further complication mainstream skeptics raise, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than dismissed. No pottery, no encampment debris, no material trace of the vast Israelite population Exodus describes camping at the mountain for over a year has ever been documented at Jabal al-Lawz. In contrast to sites in the traditional southern Sinai Peninsula, where some period-appropriate activity has been noted, that absence is real, and any honest account of this site has to carry it forward rather than around it. What survives that absence is the access question itself. A religiously charged site, adjacent to a nation's military infrastructure, inside a country now racing to open every other stretch of the same desert to outside eyes, remains the one coordinate a modern government will still not let an independent research team walk freely. The rock is still black, the perimeter is still enforced, and the specific reason a government believes that patch of ground still needs guarding has never been placed on any public record. Number 8. The Ark Turkey only just started digging into. On May 19, 1948, 3 earthquakes and heavy rain tore open a hillside 18 miles south of Mount Ararat, and a Kurdish shepherd named Reshit Sarhan found a boat-shaped ridge of stone standing where mud had been the week before. It sat there, unremarked, for over a decade until a Turkish army captain named Lan Dupnar photographed it from the air during a 1959 NATO mapping flight and gave the formation his own name. The same way an anonymous piece of terrain becomes suddenly permanent the moment someone puts a name to it. Some local tradition connects a nearby peak to Mount Judy, a mountain named in the Quran as Noah's own landing site. A separate identification, some researchers have argued, is being conflated with the formation itself, a dispute over naming that has run almost as long as the dispute over geology. For 67 years afterward, the government that controls the ground beneath that formation decided almost everything about who was allowed to touch it. A 1960 academic survey by an Ohio State geologist concluded the shape was a freak accumulation of clay pushed upward through a lava field, and no artifacts or petrified wood were found to contradict him, a verdict that held for the better part of 2 decades. Turkey then declared the site a protected national park in 1987, formally closing it to unauthorized excavation and building a visitor center overlooking the ridge. What Turkish government radar surveys found in 2014 and 2019 would force a second look at that 1960 verdict. Studies conducted under official Turkish authority using ground-penetrating radar identified the rock as composed of limonite stones forming several distinct right angles, a geometric regularity the original freak formation explanation had never accounted for. Then, in 2025, an independent research group working in partnership with Turkish universities ran a further round of ground-penetrating radar and electrical resistivity scans across the entire 515-foot formation. Soil scientist William Crabtree, analyzing samples pulled from 22 separate points around the site, reported organic matter levels roughly double what turned up in the surrounding soil, alongside altered potassium and pH readings consistent, he argued, with centuries of decayed wood rather than untouched volcanic mineral. The scans themselves reported 3 internal layers approximating a lower, second, and upper deck, a 13-foot passage running down the center of the formation, and angular chambers extending roughly 6 meters below the surface. Independent geologists responded exactly as the earlier consensus would predict, cautioning that mineral banding, differential weathering, and ordinary sediment layering can all produce right-angle anomalies without any human hand involved. And that ground-penetrating radar data in particular is notoriously easy to overinterpret without corresponding excavation to confirm it. That counter-explanation is fair, well-grounded in decades of prior geological literature on the site, and it remains, as of this recording, unrefuted by any peer-reviewed publication. The case for a natural formation is not dead, whatever the newer scans suggest. But here's where 67 years of official caution ran headlong into its own contradiction. For the first time since the 1987 park designation, the Turkish government issued formal permits in 2026, allowing the research team to begin controlled subsurface drilling and lower a small robotic camera through access points cut into the mound, permission the site had never once been granted under the natural formation explanation that had supposedly closed the question decades earlier. A government does not typically reverse a near 70-year restriction on ground it considers geologically settled. Permits, in Turkey as everywhere else, tend to follow uncertainty, not confidence. Genesis 6:15 specifies the ark's proportions down to the cubit, 300 long, 50 wide, 30 high, dimensions that convert to roughly 515 feet by 86 by 52. The Dupnar formation's measured length lines up with that figure almost exactly, a correspondence proponents have pointed to since the 1980s, and skeptics have dismissed as coincidence built on a convenient local landmark. Consider the implication either way. Whether the correspondence is real or accidental, a sovereign government spent nearly 7 decades treating a piece of ground as settled science, only to open it to drilling the moment new instruments suggested it might not be. The drilling equipment is being lowered this year through access points cut into a national park a government spent decades keeping closed. Whatever the soil beneath that ridge turns out to be, the decision to finally look is itself the story, because for 2/3 of a century, no one holding the authority to say yes ever did. Number 7. The files the SS buried for 50 years. In 1935, Heinrich Himmler founded a research institute inside his own SS command structure and gave it a deliberately bland name, Ahnenerbe, meaning ancestral heritage. Under that name, teams of SS-affiliated researchers were dispatched across 4 continents in search of religious relics and folklore Himmler believed could prove a supernatural Aryan lineage running through prehistory. One of them, a young writer named Otto Rahn, spent years combing southern France for the Holy Grail. Convinced it was hidden somewhere near a mountain fortress once held by a persecuted medieval Christian sect. He later resigned from the SS and died on a mountainside in 1939, in circumstances that have never been fully resolved. Another team, led by zoologist Ernst Schaefer in 1938, traveled to Tibet under the cover of pure scientific research, secretly measuring the physical features of local villagers in a search for what they believed were surviving traces of an original Aryan bloodline. Himmler personally corresponded with the Institute's researchers about a mythical Norse warhammer he wanted assessed as a recoverable weapon of war, and designated an entire castle, Welsburg in Westphalia, as a ceremonial headquarters modeled on Arthurian legend, complete with a room named for the Holy Grail. The organization's most infamous target was the Ark of the Covenant, which Himmler's circle believed was hidden somewhere in the Horn of Africa, and pursued with the operational seriousness the SS gave to any active military intelligence project rather than an academic hobby. Ahnenerbe records were never simple university files. They were classified internal SS documents, cross-referenced with broader Reich intelligence channels, describing expeditions and internal assessments most of the outside world would not learn existed for half a century. Beyond the artifact hunts, the Institute also directed archaeological ray excavations across occupied Poland and Czechoslovakia, reinterpreting Slavic settlement sites as evidence of ancient Germanic occupation to justify the Reich's territorial claims. Project historians have since documented used archaeology itself as a weapon of conquest, dressing military annexation in the language of restoring lost heritage. When the Ahnenerbe was formally dissolved at the war's end, its surviving members scattered back into ordinary academic positions across a newly divided Germany, and the paper trail scattered with them, sealed inside state and university archives on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Filed among records nobody outside a small circle of post-war administrators had reason to open. A Canadian historian named Michael Cater published the first serious scholarly account of the organization in 1974, drawing on what fragments of the archive he could access, and was threatened with a lawsuit for his trouble by former members still occupying respectable academic posts in West German universities. It was not until German reunification in 1990 that the fuller archival record, held for decades inside East German state repositories, became available to independent researchers on both sides of the former border, allowing the first international scholarly conference dedicated entirely to the Ahnenerbe to convene in 1998, 53 years after the organization's own records had gone dark, and 24 years after the first historian to write about it seriously was threatened into silence. What makes this particularly unsettling is not that a defeated regime tried to obscure its own history. Every defeated regime does that, and the broader catalog of Nazi-era crimes has been documented, prosecuted, and taught for 80 years without needing reunification to unlock it. What sets this file apart is that the specific category of record kept sealed the longest, buried inside a divided Germany's competing bureaucracies for nearly half a century, was the religious artifact program, the correspondence, expedition logs, and internal assessments concerning the Ark, the Grail, and a warhammer treated as recoverable military hardware rather than folklore. A modern industrial state took the pursuit of biblical and legendary relics seriously enough to classify it alongside its intelligence apparatus, and serious enough that the classification effectively outlived the government that imposed it by nearly half a century. The correspondence now sits in archives in Berlin and Koblenz. digitized, footnoted. Cross-referenced by a generation of post-war historians, available to any credentialed researcher who requests a reading room card. What is missing is not the paper anymore. It is any government, past or present, East German, West German, or reunified, ever explaining on the record why a hunt for sacred objects was treated for 5 decades as a matter of state secrecy rather than historical curiosity, and why the file documenting a hunt for sacred relics specifically took longer to surface than the file documenting the death camps themselves. Number 6. The clay tablets the Pentagon held for years. On April 10, 2003, 2 days after American forces reached Baghdad, looters broke through the unguarded doors of the Iraq National Museum. Museum staff had fled only 48 hours earlier after removing what they could carry to an underground bunker and sealing additional pieces inside the vaults of Iraq's central bank. For the next 36 hours, the museum holding the largest collection of Mesopotamian antiquities on Earth had no one guarding it at all. Its director, Donnie George Ukana, had personally gone to the U.S. Marine headquarters at Baghdad's Palestine Hotel days earlier to beg for protection. None arrived for 3 more days. When Marine Corps Colonel Matthew Bogdanos arrived on April 22 to lead the recovery investigation, he found gallery cases shattered and storerooms ransacked. Roughly 15,000 items were gone, among them nearly 5,000 cylinder seals, and a body of cuneiform tablets, statuettes, and inscribed pottery spanning the Sumerian, Assyrian, and Babylonian record. The same civilizations that conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, exiled the kingdom of Judah, and appear by name across the historical and prophetic books of the Old Testament. The alabaster Warka vase, one of the earliest known examples of narrative religious art anywhere in the ancient world, was among the missing pieces, later recovered buried on a farm south of the city. The so-called Mask of Warka, a Sumerian carved face already nicknamed the Mona Lisa of Mesopotamia by museum staff, turned up the same way months later. The Bush administration's initial public response was dismissive, stuff happens. In the words of one senior official, even as museum staff had spent the preceding weeks pleading with American commanders stationed nearby for protection that never came. The scale of the loss triggered a recovery operation that has now run more than 2 decades, involving the FBI, Homeland Security Investigations, and Interpol, tracking artifacts as they surfaced in New York auction houses, Swiss galleries, private collections across Europe and Japan, and eventually on eBay. But here's where the recovery story complicates the narrative of restitution. Thousands of the recovered tablets and seals did not go straight back to Baghdad. They went first into American government evidence custody, held for years, in some cases well over a decade, inside U.S. federal storage, while prosecutors built provenance cases and diplomatic channels negotiated formal repatriation agreements. A single shipment of roughly 17,000 artifacts was not returned to Iraq until 2021, 18 years after the looting. Having spent most of the intervening period in the custody of the very country whose own forces had left the museum unguarded in the first place. As recently as 2022 and 2023, additional shipments of a few dozen cylinder seals and cuneiform seals at a time continued arriving back in Baghdad from federal custody in New York, each one accompanied by a formal repatriation ceremony. Each one a small acknowledgement of just how long that particular piece of the exile-era record had sat waiting on American soil. Among the material recovered and held in that federal custody were cuneiform administrative and chronicle fragments dating to the Babylonian exile period, the same centuries when the biblical record describes the deportations under Nebuchadnezzar. The destruction of the Jerusalem temple and the eventual release of exiles under the Persian king Cyrus, all events independently documented in Babylonian court and administrative archives of exactly the same tablet tradition for over a century. 2 Kings 25 records Jerusalem's fall and the deportation of its people to Babylon in terms Babylonian administrative records have corroborated an outline since long before this looting ever occurred. More than 8,000 items from the 2003 looting are still missing, unaccounted for in any collection, public or private, anywhere in the world. And museum staff have long noted that many of the smaller cuneiform tablets are effectively untraceable once they enter the private market, since so few had been individually photographed or cataloged before the war began. The recovered pieces that did make it home now sit behind reinforced glass in a museum that closed twice more after 2003, once for a decade of restoration work. Once again during renewed civil unrest in 2019, not reopening fully until 2022. The tablets that survived carry the administrative record of an empire that once carried a nation into exile and, centuries later, allowed it to return. For as long as 18 years, some of that same record sat in a different kind of custody, in a different country, waiting on a government's permission to go home. Standard household filters usually get you an ad-free version of this if you want the deeper research without the sponsor breaks. But sticking with the free version means you'll want to bear with the next quick ad, and then we'll get into the 5 heaviest cases on this list. Number 5. The scroll the army went AND took. In 1960, an American clergyman named Joe Uhrig offered Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin a sample from a scroll he claimed to be selling on behalf of a Bethlehem antiquities dealer. Yadin paid a $10,000 deposit and heard nothing more for 7 years. The dealer, a shoemaker named Khalil Iskander Shaheen, known across Jerusalem simply as Kondo. And already infamous among archaeologists as the middleman behind the very first Dead Sea Scrolls to reach scholarly hands back in the late 1940s, had quietly kept this new scroll rolled inside a shoebox, hidden beneath the floor tiles of his own bedroom, while asking price negotiations dragged on, climbed as high as $200,000, and eventually collapsed entirely. This was not Yadin's first scroll acquired through unconventional channels. In 1947, his own father had tried and failed to buy the first Dead Sea Scrolls before his death, and Yadin himself later completed the purchase of 4 additional scrolls in 1954 through an intermediary, after their owner, a Syrian church leader, who had displayed them for years in the United States without finding a buyer, placed a classified advertisement for them in the Wall Street Journal. The Temple Scroll would be the last, and by far the most dramatic, of his acquisitions. Then came June 1967. As Israeli forces occupied Bethlehem during the Six-Day War, Yadin, who was serving at the time as a special security advisor to Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, in addition to his standing as the country's most prominent field archaeologist, arranged for Israeli military intelligence officers to go directly to Kondo's house. They detained him and searched the property until they found the shoebox beneath the tiles. The scroll, nearly 30 feet long and the longest manuscript ever recovered from the Qumran caves, changed hands not through a dealer's counter, but through a wartime military operation, ordered by a government advisor who also happened to be the country's leading Dead Sea Scrolls scholar. Kondo was eventually paid roughly $108,000, funded jointly by the Israeli government and an outside philanthropic foundation, a fraction of what he had originally demanded. And a transaction scholars have debated as coercive ever since, given that it took place under active military occupation rather than open negotiation between willing parties. When Israeli soldiers took East Jerusalem in that same campaign, they also secured the building that had, for 2 decades under Jordanian administration, controlled international access to the rest of the Dead Sea Scrolls corpus. What had been, for 7 years, a slow and contested antiquities market transaction became, within a matter of days, a matter decided entirely by a government's armed forces during a shooting war. Here is where the standard account of an ordinary antiquities recovery runs into a complication. Kondo's own family has maintained for decades that the raid on the house amounted to seizure under duress rather than a negotiated sale, and Israeli officials have never fully settled that dispute on the public record, even as the government continued paying installments toward the agreed price for years afterward. The state that recovered the scroll has never denied that its own intelligence officers physically removed it from a private residence during wartime. It is simply maintained that fair compensation followed. The document itself lays out temple purity regulations in exacting, almost architectural detail, building specifications, priestly procedures, sacrificial calendars, and ritual boundaries. Material that echoes and expands on the temple vision Ezekiel records in his closing chapters, a section of scripture long treated by many readers as more symbolic blueprint than literal building code. Consider the implication of a government treating a religious legal text with that degree of urgency in the middle of an active war. This was not passive preservation. It was acquisition by the state, under military authority, in the same week that state soldiers were fighting street by street through the very city the text describes governing, recovered by the same nation whose modern capital now sits beside the ruins of the temple the scrolls laws were written to regulate. The scrolls' condition on recovery told its own story of decades spent hidden away from proper conservation. Humidity had turned entire sections to pulp. Ink had transferred backward through compressed layers of parchment so severely that portions of the text could only be read in mirror image, requiring specialists to photograph and reverse entire columns before a single word could be translated. It took Yadin 6 more years of study before he completed the first full analysis of a document his own government soldiers had pulled from beneath a stranger's bedroom floor, and even longer before an English translation reached international scholars outside Israel, delayed in part by his own appointment to a national commission investigating a separate military failure entirely. The scroll now rests inside a specially built museum wing in Jerusalem, climate-controlled, publicly displayed, thoroughly translated into multiple languages for scholars and visitors alike. What sits less comfortably on public display is the manner of its arrival, a sacred legal text, recovered not by an archaeologist's patient negotiation, but by a government's soldiers. Acting on a scholar's orders, in the middle of a war neither the scroll nor the shoemaker who hid it had any part in starting. Number 4. The Vatican files sealed for 14 years. For 14 years, Vatican archivists worked quietly to prepare an enormous body of material for release, roughly 16 million documents across some 20,000 archival units. Spanning the entire 1939 to 1958 pontificate of Pope Pius VI, covering the exact critical years when the Holocaust unfolded across a continent where the Catholic Church maintained parishes, nuncitures, and informants in nearly every occupied city. The material had been kept under the Vatican's standard 70-year rule, which would not otherwise have opened this specific archive to outside scholars until 2028. The pressure to open it early had been building for decades. A 1963 German stage play accused Pius of complicit silence while 6 million Jews were murdered under Nazi occupation, a charge that gained wider currency through subsequent books in the following decades. Historians, journalists, and Jewish advocacy organizations alike spent the following half-century pressing the Vatican for access to the internal record, not the public statements which were already well documented, but the private diplomatic traffic that might reveal what the Pope knew, when he knew it, and who inside the Vatican's own bureaucracy was urging him to speak publicly or to remain silent for the sake of protecting church operations under occupation. Earlier attempts to settle the question fell well short of what a full archive could offer. In 1965, Pope Paul VI ordered a small commission of Jesuit historians to search the archives specifically to rebut the play's accusations, and their work, published across 11 volumes between 1965 and 1981 as records of the Holy See relating to the war, remains the single most cited source on the subject to this day. But those volumes were selected and edited by scholars answering directly to the Vatican itself, working from a limited, curated set of documents the Church chose to release, not the full, unfiltered internal correspondence historians outside the Church had spent decades trying to reach. In March 2019, Pope Francis announced the archive would open 8 years ahead of its scheduled release, telling assembled Vatican archive staff that the Church was not afraid of history and loved it as it loved God. On March 2, 2020, roughly 1,300,000 digitized documents became available to credentialed researchers for the first time, drawn from the Vatican's Secretariat of State the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and nunciature records scattered across the continent. More than 150 scholars had already applied for access before the doors opened, including a team from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Here is where the standard defense of Pius C runs into real trouble. Vatican officials have long argued that Pius pursued quiet, behind-the-scenes diplomacy rather than public condemnation, calculating that open protest might have accelerated rather than slowed the killing. Some of what has since emerged from the newly opened files supports exactly that account. Documented evidence of covert support for at least 3 internal German plots against Hitler, and records showing priests across Central and Northern Europe working in the Vatican's own archival language to save people, Jews included, through channels that left no public trace at the time. Historian David Kurtzer, who reserved a research desk for months once the archive opened, has noted that a great deal is already known about what Pius did publicly. What remained locked away for 3/4 of a century was the internal deliberation, who inside the Vatican argued for speaking out and who argued for caution during the years it mattered most. But the files also expose exactly how thin the outside world's actual evidence base had been before 2020. For 60 years. The entire international debate over one of the 20th century's most consequential silences was conducted almost entirely without access to the primary internal record, because that record sat sealed inside a sovereign city-state's own archive, released only when its own leadership chose the timing, the scope, and the pace of access. Decades of books, documentaries, and academic careers were built on secondhand testimony and partial document releases, arguing a case whose central evidence remained physically locked less than a mile from where the argument was taking place. The location itself carries its own quiet irony. The archive sits roughly 800 yards from St. Peter's Square, close enough that Germany's wartime ambassador to the Vatican reported back to Hitler that consequential decisions were being made, in his own words, under the Pope's very windows. Whatever was decided in those rooms between 1939 and 1945 stayed sealed inside them for 3/4 of a century before anyone outside the Vatican's own staff was permitted to read a single page of the internal record. Access, even now, is not open in any ordinary sense. Researchers must hold a completed university degree in a relevant field and submit a formal letter to the head of the archives explaining precisely what they intend to study before a reservation is granted, and the documents themselves cannot be photographed or removed from the reading room. A researcher sits at one of those assigned desks today. Roughly 800 yards from the square where Catholics still gather to hear the current Pope speak, turning pages a sovereign state chose, entirely on its own timetable and inside its own walled building, to finally let one credentialed pair of hands hold. Number 3. The oldest library in Christendom, taken by court order. For over 1,400 years, a small community of Greek Orthodox monks has lived inside a fortified compound at the foot of a mountain in the Sinai desert, built between 548 and 565, on the direct orders of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, around a site the monastery holds to be the exact location of the burning bush. In 623, according to a document the community has preserved and displayed for 14 centuries, the Prophet Muhammad himself granted the monks protection from taxation and military conscription. That protection held, in one legal form or another, through Byzantine rule, early Islamic conquest, Ottoman administration, French occupation under Napoleon, British mandated oversight, and 2 successive modern Egyptian governments. On May 28, 2025, an Egyptian appellate court in Ismailia ended it. A 160-page ruling determined that the monastery's underlying land is part of Egypt's public domain, that the monks hold only usufruct rights as occupants rather than owners of the ground beneath their own church, and that the state now controls access to specific buildings within the walled compound the monks have occupied without interruption since the 6th century. Some Egyptian officials framed the decision as a heritage protection measure, with one archaeologist connected to the case arguing the monastery's real estate properly falls under cultural property statutes rather than religious ownership. An Orthodox news service described the ruling instead as one of the most serious violations of religious and individual freedom in recent centuries. Greece's foreign minister took the unusual step of directly engaging his Egyptian counterpart over the decision within a week of its release, opening a small diplomatic rupture between two governments that had otherwise maintained close relations. The mainstream framing of the case treats it as an ordinary property dispute, a long-running administrative and legal question about land titles, finally resolved by a competent court after years of filings, no different in form from thousands of other rulings issued in Egypt every year. But here's where that framing runs out of road. It accounts for the paperwork and for the sequence of legal offensives against the monastery's autonomy that analysts trace back through multiple prior Egyptian governments. What it cannot account for is what sits inside the specific walls the ruling now controls, the second largest collection of early Christian manuscripts on Earth, outnumbered only by the Vatican Library itself. A collection scholars have spent nearly a decade digitizing precisely because the monastery's remote isolation had kept it safe from the destruction that swept so many comparable archives elsewhere in the region. It was inside these same walls, in the 19th century, that one of the oldest surviving complete manuscripts of the Christian Bible was found and eventually removed from the monastery's keeping entirely, a departure the monks have never stopped regretting. The timing carries its own weight. The ruling arrived less than a decade after an attack by an Islamic State affiliate at a checkpoint near the monastery killed a policeman and injured 3 others. A reminder that the wider Sinai Peninsula has spent much of the past 15 years under a hardened military security posture the Egyptian government has justified as necessary counterinsurgency. A court decision stripping a 1,400-year-old religious community of its legal autonomy over its own walls arrived inside that same broader climate of state control over the peninsula, a climate that, elsewhere on this list, has already closed off an entire mountain associated with the Exodus narrative to independent research. Exodus 3 describes the ground at that mountain as holy, sanctified specifically by a divine presence rather than by any human institution or government decree. For 14 centuries, the monks who occupied that ground answered to their own archbishop and their own community rule, negotiating access and protection directly with whichever empire or caliphate happened to control the surrounding desert. As of May 2025, for the first time in the monastery's entire recorded history, the modern nation-state surrounding it holds legal authority over which of its own rooms its own monks may enter. The manuscripts are still on the shelves. The library still operates, at least for now, under the same small community of monks who have kept it for generations, its Guinness-recognized status as the world's oldest continuously operating library still technically intact. Visiting hours remain deliberately restricted even now. The compound opens at 9 in the morning and closes to outside visitors by noon, and the site has never allowed itself to be treated as an ordinary tourist attraction, a boundary the monks maintained through Ottoman rule, British oversight, and every prior Egyptian government without needing a court to enforce it. What no longer exists after 1,400 years of continuous exception is any guarantee that any of it continues on terms the monastery itself controls, rather than terms a foreign ministry decides to grant. The case remains open on appeal as of this recording, with the South Sinai regional government still contesting the scope of its own authority, even as the core ruling stands, and with the monastery's own legal team pursuing every available channel to have the underlying judgment reversed or narrowed before it becomes permanent. A library that survived the fall of Byzantium, the rise and retreat of the Crusades, and 14 centuries of shifting empires around it now depends, for the first time in its recorded history, on the outcome of a filing in an Egyptian appellate court. Number 2. The survey that was never really about archaeology. In 1865, a group of British clergymen, scholars, and aristocrats founded the Palestine Exploration Fund in London under royal patronage, stating its purpose as the scientific study of the Holy Land's antiquities, geography, geology, and natural history. For its first 21 years, the fund operated almost entirely on the resources of a single government office, the intelligence department of the British War Office, which supplied the trained Royal Engineers officers who carried out virtually all the actual fieldwork on the ground. An early survey, led by Captain Charles Wilson in 1864, had originally been commissioned for an ostensibly humanitarian purpose, mapping Jerusalem's water systems to combat outbreaks of cholera and malaria in the Old City. That survey instead produced detailed military-grade maps of Jerusalem, uncovered ancient cisterns, and identified the underground archway now known by Wilson's own name. A subsequent Royal Engineers officer, Charles Warren, spent the years from 1867 to 1870 sinking shafts and tunneling beneath the Temple Mount itself in search of the original walls of Solomon's and Herod's temples, work carried out with military-grade excavation equipment under the nose of Ottoman authorities who had explicitly forbidden open digging on the site. The pattern repeated for the next 2 decades: a stated humanitarian, religious, or scholarly purpose, trained military personnel doing the actual work, and a final product of exceptional strategic value that the fund's own public reports rarely dwelled on. In July 1872, 2 Royal Engineers officers, Lieutenants Claude Conder and a young Horatio Kitchener, who would later command the entire British Army as Lord Kitchener of Khartoum, began a systematic survey of western Palestine that would run 5 years and cover more than 6,000 square miles. In July 1875, Conder was wounded in an attack by armed brigands near Safed and evacuated to England, leaving Kitchener alone to complete the project. Their published maps, released in 26 detailed sheets in 1880, recorded the topography, water sources, road networks, and ancient ruins of the entire region with a precision no purely civilian expedition of the era could plausibly have funded, staffed, or protected in hostile territory. Numbers 13 records Moses dispatching 12 men to scout the land of Canaan ahead of Israel's entry. Instructed specifically to note its terrain, its water sources, its fortifications, and the strength of the peoples living there, a reconnaissance mission by any modern military definition. Conder and Kitchener's survey served the identical function for a very different army, 32 centuries later, funded not by 12 tribal leaders, but by a global empire's war office. What makes this particularly hard to file away as pure scholarship is what happened 4 decades later. In 1917, when General Edmund Allenby led British Empire forces into Ottoman-held Palestine, the military survey teams supporting his advance built their new operational maps directly on top of Conder and Kitchener's 19th century survey sheets, the same terrain notes, the same water sources, the same road networks, now guiding an invading army's advance instead of an academic society's quarterly publication. An organization that had spent over 2 decades describing itself publicly as a scholarly and religious pursuit had, without ever once amending its founding charter, produced the foundational military intelligence later used for the British conquest of the Holy Land. There is a defense of the fund that deserves to be stated fairly. Its founders were, by every surviving account, sincere scholars and clergymen genuinely devoted to biblical geography, and much of their published work, the 8-volume memoirs on topography and archaeology, the detailed name lists of Arabic place names collected village by village, has no plausible military application at all, and has served biblical scholarship faithfully for a century and a half. The War Office funded the fieldwork because it was cheaper and better organized than any alternative, not necessarily because it had secretly commissioned a religious survey as cover. The fund itself still exists in London today, its 19th century archive of survey notebooks, photographs, and correspondence now a standard research stop for any historian of the region's exploration. Still cited in academic bibliographies without most readers ever pausing over the words War Office funding buried in its founding history. Consider the implication regardless of intent. Nearly every subsequent excavation across modern Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories, the identification of biblical tells, the mapping of ancient roads, the location of springs and ruins named across the Old and New Testaments traces its methodological root back to a survey whose funding, trained personnel, and eventual operational purpose were unmistakably military and imperial in origin, whatever the founders' private motives. Biblical archaeology as a formal discipline was not founded quietly inside a university seminar room. It was founded by a war office, using Royal Engineers officers trained specifically to gather military intelligence, in a project whose academic output happened to double 50 years later as an occupying army's terrain map. The maps are still the base layer beneath many modern surveys of the region. The modern border between Israel and Lebanon still follows, in part. The exact point in Upper Galilee where Condor and Kitchener's survey teams stopped walking in 1877. Warren's shafts beneath the Temple Mount are still there too, sealed off now, referenced in nearly every subsequent study of the Mount's substructure, without most visitors ever learning a foreign army's engineers dug them a century and a half ago under cover of biblical research. A discipline that has spent a century and a half presenting itself to the public as an academic pursuit of scripture and stone was built, at its very foundation, by a government office that needed the same terrain information for an entirely different reason, and simply never bothered to correct the record afterward. Number 1. The spy satellites that rewrote the map of the biblical world. On February 22, 1995, President Bill Clinton signed Executive Order 1951, releasing 800,000 photographs from Corona, the program that had been America's first and most secret spy satellite system, flying continuously through the height of the Cold War from 1960 onward. For 35 years, the very existence of the program had itself been classified. The public did not officially learn Corona had ever flown until the same afternoon its archive was unlocked. A further release followed of imagery from the KH-7 program, a higher-resolution successor system tasked specifically against sites Corona had already flagged for closer inspection. In 2011, a second wave of declassification opened the archive of Hexagon, the intelligence program that had succeeded Corona, though that material would not become widely available for scanning and public download until sometime between 2020 and 2022. For over 3 decades combined, this entire body of imagery had existed for exactly one purpose: tracking Soviet military installations, missile silos, and troop movements from low orbit. Photographed at a resolution good enough to count individual vehicles on a runway. None of it had been built with archaeology anywhere in mind, and no one who authorized its collection ever imagined a biblical historian would be the one to finally put it to use. Archaeologists working in the Near East noticed almost immediately what the American intelligence community had inadvertently handed them: high-resolution photographs of the entire region taken in the 1960s, decades before modern irrigation. Urban sprawl and mechanized agriculture erased countless traces of the ancient landscape from the ground itself. A Harvard archaeologist named Jason began combing the declassified frames of northeastern Syria for faint linear traces cut into the soil, the shadows of ancient roads, worn into the earth over centuries of repeated foot and cart traffic, visible from space in a way they had never once been visible from the ground, and long since paved over or plowed under by the time any archaeologist could, have walked the same terrain. His 2003 study, published in the journal Antiquity and awarded that year's Ben Cullen Prize, was built entirely on this repurposed spy imagery. It mapped 1,192 individual road segments stretching a combined 1,712. 9 kilometers across the Bronze Age landscape of northern Mesopotamia, an interconnected network of hollow ways revealing agricultural and trade systems no ground survey had ever fully documented, hiding in plain sight inside photographs the American government had taken specifically to watch for Soviet tanks. But here is where a purely triumphant reading of the declassification runs into its own complication. The same imagery that revealed those ancient road networks also documents, with equal clarity, just how much of that landscape has been destroyed in the 3 decades since the photographs were taken. Your's own subsequent work has tracked the accelerating loss of these features to modern agriculture, dam construction, and, in more recent years, deliberate destruction during regional conflict. The declassification did not preserve this landscape. It arrived just in time to photograph it before it disappeared. and the archive is now, in significant part, a record of a world that no longer physically exists anywhere except inside a government's discarded intelligence files. 2 Kings 18 and 19 record the Assyrian king Sennacherib's campaign against the kingdom of Judah in exacting geographic and logistical detail, march routes, siege positions outside Jerusalem's walls, and a sudden catastrophic loss of his army before the city ever fell. Ur's later research, drawing on this same declassified imagery, traced the actual canal systems Sennacherib's own royal engineers built to water Assyria's agricultural heartland around Nineveh, published in a dedicated 2005 study combining the Cold War photographs with ground-level survey. Those canals are visible in the satellite frames precisely because 1960s Iraq and Syria had not yet been transformed by the large-scale agricultural and urban development of the following decades, and several stretches identified from orbit have since been destroyed on the ground entirely, meaning the declassified photographs are now, for those specific segments, the only surviving record of the engineering that once irrigated an empire's capital. A body of spy satellite imagery, gathered to track an entirely different empire's tanks 2,600 years later, ended up confirming the physical infrastructure of the exact empire scripture describes marching against Jerusalem and then withdrawing without taking it. What makes this the most consequential entry on this entire list is not any single confirmed site, and not any one biblical alignment, however precise. It is scale. Before 1995, archaeological survey across the entire Fertile Crescent depended on ground teams walking measured transects on foot, or on aerial photography that had to be separately commissioned, funded, and cleared for each individual survey area, a process that made comprehensive, cross-border landscape mapping of the ancient Near East essentially impossible for most of the 20th century, no matter how well-funded any single expedition happened to be. After 1995, a single declassified American intelligence archive, gathered continuously across 3 decades by a government watching for something else entirely, became instantly available to any researcher with a library card and an internet connection, covering the entire region Scripture calls home inside one unified, searchable dataset. Other archaeologists across the field followed the same trail had opened. British researcher David Kennedy used the same declassified frames to identify previously unrecorded sites across Turkey and the wider Levant, publishing his own findings in the same journal within a year of the first release. A resource that took the United States government 3 decades and untold billions of dollars to build for the sole purpose of watching an enemy that no longer exists had. Within a few short years of its release, become the single most cited archaeological dataset for an entire region of the ancient world, cited not for what it showed of the 20th century, but for what it had accidentally preserved of the 10th century before Christ. Somewhere inside that archive sits a single black and white frame, taken by a satellite whose name was itself classified for decades, showing one faint hollow way outside Nineveh that no ground survey ever recorded and no living person has ever walked. A line in the dirt an Assyrian work crew cut 2,500 years before the camera that photographed it was built to watch for something else entirely. And that now exists nowhere else on Earth except inside a government's discarded intelligence file. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.